On February 28, 2026, Donald Trump initiated a war that has now extended into its 16th day. Over 6,000 targets have been struck across Iran, and more than $11 billion was spent in the first 6 days alone. Tragically, 7 American service members have lost their lives, and oil prices have surged past $115 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed to Western shipping. As of today, Trump is on Truth Social, imploring China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom to send warships to keep a vital waterway open that his own military actions have shut down. So far, not a single one of those countries has committed to this request. In the next few minutes, I will detail how Trump ended up isolated in this situation, how his closest allies have refused to align with him, how he threatened Spain with a trade war only to face public humiliation, and how his Gulf partners are quietly advising each other to stay out of the conflict. This diplomatic collapse is not merely a footnote to the war. It represents its most dangerous unresolved variable. Before we proceed, thank you for tuning in. Your support keeps this channel going, and I genuinely appreciate it. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the like button. It helps get this information to more people who need to see it. Let's examine what the opening of this war looked like from across the Atlantic. The United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran early on February 28th without adequately consulting the allies they expected to support them. A senior Italian government official, one of Europe's most pro-Trump leaders, was in Dubai when the bombs began to fall. He learned about the operation the same way civilians did. According to a U.S. official who spoke to CNN, that official had no prior knowledge that the operation was coming. As one analyst put it, the United States launched its largest military offensive since the 2003 Iraq invasion in a region filled with allied personnel, bases, and economies, yet did not inform its closest partners. This single detail is the foundation of everything that followed. Spain was the first to react, and it did so with significant force. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez immediately condemned the U.S. and Israeli strikes as an unjustified and dangerous military intervention outside the framework of international law. He instructed his government not to allow the United States to use the Rota naval base or the air base, 2 major joint installations on Spanish soil, for operations against Iran. When this decision became public, Trump threatened to sever all trade with Spain. His exact words on Tuesday were that Washington could cut off all trade with Madrid, and he implied that the U.S. could use the bases anyway, stating, "We could just fly in and use it." Spain did not flinch in response. Then came a moment that revealed just how tenuous Trump's grip on the situation truly was. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt stepped up to the podium and told reporters that Spain had heard the president's message loud and clear, and that, to her understanding, the Spanish government had agreed to cooperate with the U.S. military. She made this statement on the record, but within minutes, Foreign Minister José Manuel Álvarez was on Spanish radio refuting her claim, stating, "I can refute this. Not a single comma has changed. I have no idea whatsoever what they might be referring to." The White House had fabricated a capitulation that simply did not exist, and Spain publicly called them out on it. In real time, Sánchez summarized his government's entire position in 4 words: no to the war. He dispatched a frigate to Cyprus for defensive operations and made it clear that Spain would honor its NATO obligations while refusing to budge any further. The European Commission backed him, and Emmanuel Macron expressed solidarity. Germany and Belgium both declared their opposition to deploying forces in support of U.S. offensive operations. Even within Spain, the political fight over the war exposed the same fracture lines that split alliances across the entire continent, with the right wing demanding compliance with Washington and the left insisting on adherence to international law. While a war not of their making raged across the Mediterranean, the UK made a different calculation, but not without its own ruptures. Before the war began, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had denied Trump's request to use British military bases for offensive operations against Iran. The UK Attorney General was reportedly advising that the U.S.-Israeli operation may not comply with international law. During Prime Minister's questions, Keir Starmer stood in Parliament and told MPs that his government remembered the mistakes of Iraq. He pledged that the UK would operate only on a lawful basis with a well-thought-out plan and that Britain would not join offensive action. Trump expressed his irritation in a statement to the Daily Telegraph, saying it had taken far too long for Starmer to come around. The so-called special relationship was visibly cracking in front of a global audience. Eventually, Starmer authorized the use of British bases, but only for what his government termed defensive strikes, intercepting Iranian missiles and drones, not launching offensive operations into Iran. That distinction is crucial. The UK is involved in this war, but it has drawn a legal red line around participating in the operation that initiated it. The UK's Energy Secretary told Sky News this week that ending the war is the best and quickest way to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. That language reflects an ally who does not believe in this campaign. It indicates a desire to distance themselves from it. France's position has been similarly cautious. Macron called for emergency discussions at the United Nations and warned that military action conducted outside international law risks undermining global stability. France sent anti-missile and anti-drone systems to Cyprus and stated it is working on a possible international escort mission for the Strait of Hormuz. However, it stressed that such a mission must occur only when circumstances permit, meaning after the fighting subsides. This is a conditional commitment tied to a situation that does not yet exist. Now, here's where things start to unravel in a different way entirely, because the countries with the most to lose from this war are not in Europe. They are in the Gulf. Trump's relationship with those governments is deteriorating in a manner that few in Washington anticipated. The Gulf Cooperation Council, comprising Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman, has been under direct Iranian fire for 16 days. Drones have struck hotels in Dubai, and the Ras Tanura refinery in Saudi Arabia has sustained damage from intercepted debris. Qatar's Qatar Energy halted liquefied natural gas production after Iranian strikes hit its facilities and declared force majeure on global contracts. Kuwait has completely halted crude production, and Bahrain's infrastructure has been targeted, including damage to a desalination plant. These are not peripheral consequences. These governments are witnessing their economies deteriorate in real time due to a war they were not asked to join, and many of them actively lobbied against it before it started. Middle East Eye reported that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was privately furious about the scale and timing of the U.S. and Israeli strikes. Multiple Gulf Arab sources described senior Saudi officials expressing anger that Washington had launched the operation against their objections. On the day the war began, Saudi Arabia confirmed that its airspace and territory would not be used to attack Iran. That pledge has held firm. Then, Senator Lindsey Graham, Trump's most vocal ally in Congress, flew to Israel and returned to Washington demanding to know why Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states were refusing to join offensive operations against Iran. He publicly questioned why the United States should defend partners who refused to participate in what he described as a shared struggle, warning that consequences would follow if they did not. That statement did not go unnoticed in the Gulf. A Dubai-based billionaire named Khalaf al-Habtoor posted a response on X that was later deleted, but the essence was captured before it vanished. He wrote that the Gulf states are well aware of why they are under attack and know who dragged the entire region into this dangerous escalation without consulting those he calls his allies. The post was deleted, but the sentiment remained. There is a structural reason why the Gulf states will not join this offensive, and it has nothing to do with loyalty to Iran. These governments are Iran's permanent neighbors. American forces will eventually leave the Middle East, but Iran will not. A UAE official told CNN that relations with Tehran will eventually have to normalize, even if it takes decades to rebuild what he termed a huge trust gap. Bahrain, which has a majority Shia population and a Sunni ruling family, is already witnessing pro-Iran protests in its streets as the war continues. Saudi Arabia shares a southern border with Yemen, where Iran-backed Houthi rebels have recently pulled back from years of attacks on Saudi territory. Entering the war offensively could instantly reignite that front. Furthermore, Gulf states are now reassessing their overseas investments. A Gulf official informed CNN that just months after Trump touted trillions of dollars in investment pledges from the region as an economic triumph, the entire financial architecture of Trump's Gulf diplomacy is now under strain due to a war those governments explicitly warned him against starting. Now let's connect what's happening on the diplomatic front to the situation at sea, as that connection reveals the full cost of this isolation. The Strait of Hormuz typically carries about 1/5 of the world's oil supply on any given day. Iran declared it effectively closed to U.S. and allied shipping the moment the war commenced. More than 150 commercial vessels have remained anchored outside the strait, unable to cross. At least 10 tankers have been struck, targeted, or have had attacks reported against them since February 28th. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has vowed to keep the waterway closed as a means of pressure. A senior Iranian official has publicly stated that oil prices could rise beyond $200 a barrel if the conflict persists. Brent crude has already surpassed $115, and American gasoline prices have risen more than 23% since the war began. According to AIA, the International Energy Agency announced the largest coordinated emergency reserve release in its history, nearly 412 million barrels, just to stabilize markets. For context, the largest previous release was 182.7 million barrels following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Germany, Austria, and Japan have all confirmed they will draw down their reserves. This is not a routine measure. It is an international triage operation. Amid all this, the Strait of Hormuz sits at the center of a precarious standoff. The IRGC declared the strait closed on March 2nd. A senior IRGC commander publicly stated that any vessel attempting to pass would be set ablaze. At least 5 tankers have sustained damage, and over 150 ships are anchored outside the strait to avoid attack. The IRGC warned this week that it would not allow a single liter of oil to pass through the strait and threatened that prices could reach $200 a barrel. Trump has threatened to strike Iran 20 times harder if the strait is not reopened, and has discussed the possibility of U.S. forces taking control of the waterway, an idea that legal experts quickly noted has no basis in international maritime law since the strait passes through Iranian and Omani sovereign waters. On Tuesday, U.S. forces targeted 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait. 2 Indian-flagged LNG carriers briefly passed through on Saturday, signaling a fragile possibility that selective passage may be feasible for some nations. However, for Western commercial shipping, the route remains effectively closed. The economic costs are compounding with each passing day. The UAE is in a precarious position. It hosts major U.S. military installations, including Al Dhafra Air Base and Al Minhad Air Base, the very facilities Iran has cited as justification for its strikes. Yet, the UAE has not joined the war offensively. Its government has condemned Iran's attacks as violations of national sovereignty, withdrawn its ambassador from Tehran without severing ties entirely, and declined to retaliate militarily, with analysts noting that the Emirates cannot contribute anything to this fight that the Americans and Israelis do not already possess. The UAE's strategy is to absorb and deflect while preserving its reputation as a stable hub, even as that reputation is being tested like never before. The cost to evacuate Dubai by private jet soared to $250,000 on March 3rd. Hotels slashed prices to maintain occupancy, and schools shifted to remote learning. Oil production in the UAE dropped by between 500,000 and 800,000 barrels per day. The Emirate has arrested individuals for filming missile interceptions overhead, while some have posted AI-generated fake damage videos that complicated the information environment. 60-year-old British tourists have been charged under cybercrime laws for photographing missiles in the sky. This is what life looks like in a city of 3.5 million people amidst a regional war. So where does this situation lead from here? There are 3 distinct trajectories this conflict could take, and only one appears genuinely stable. The first is the escalation ladder. The K Island strike was the most significant single U.S. escalation since the war began. It fundamentally altered what Iran will accept. If the U.S. now moves to strike K Island's actual oil infrastructure, the pipelines, loading jetties, and storage tanks, it could eliminate between 1.5 and 1.7 million barrels of Iranian daily export capacity. According to J.P. Morgan estimates, Iran has promised that any such strike will trigger a coordinated assault on every American-linked oil and energy facility in the Gulf. The fire at Fujairah today is not the ceiling. It is a signal of what comes next if escalation continues unchecked. Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura, Abu Dhabi's ADNOC terminals, and any infrastructure connected to a U.S. company in the region are now fair targets according to Iran's stated doctrine. The second trajectory is a managed pause. There are fragile and unverified signals that diplomatic backchannels remain open. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has not yet fully defined his military posture. Some Gulf states, including Qatar, have actively sought to facilitate a ceasefire. The UN Security Council is considering a resolution demanding that Iran halt its attacks on neighboring Gulf states. The GCC countries are increasingly calling for de-escalation, partly out of genuine concern for their populations and partly because they recognize that prolonged warfare would undermine their economic model. Their political legitimacy hinges on achieving a managed pause, not a peace, but a ceasefire that freezes the situation while keeping all parties' grievances formally unresolved. This remains theoretically possible, but it requires both sides to want it. Right now, Iran has publicly stated that it sees no room for diplomacy after being struck while negotiations were underway. The third trajectory is the long grind. Even if the intensity of active combat decreases in the coming weeks, the structural damage to the global energy market has already been inflicted. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz, even if temporary, has exposed vulnerabilities that energy markets have treated as theoretical risks for decades. The entire system is more fragile than previously suggested. Qatar Energy halting LNG production was not a hypothetical scenario. It actually happened. Saudi Aramco declaring that continued warfare would yield drastic effects on the global economy was not mere conjecture. It reflects operational reality. The insurance markets, shipping lanes, spare capacity assumptions, and reserve calculations are all being revised in real time. Even after this specific war concludes, premiums will remain elevated, routing patterns will change, and diversification investments that have been delayed for years will accelerate overnight. The architecture of global energy trade is being redesigned under fire. What occurred in Fujairah this morning is, in one sense, just one fire at one port on one day. In another sense, it represents the latest data point in a pattern that has been developing since February 28th. This is a pattern of systematic, deliberate targeting of the infrastructure that connects the world's energy supply to its demand. The exit ramps are being hit, the main highway is closed, reserves are being drawn down, and prices are moving in one direction. Trump struck K Island, Iran struck Fujairah. The Strait of Hormuz is closed to most traffic, with Brent crude trading above $100. The IRGC has now advised residents of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Fujairah to stay away from the ports. If you're watching this and wondering whether this crisis affects you, whether it matters beyond the headlines, consider this. Every 10% rise in global oil prices adds approximately 0.4% to inflation. According to IMF Analysts, Brent has risen more than 40% in just 14 days. The fertilizer for the food you consume is stuck in supply chains that route through the Gulf. The electronics you purchase depend on components that travel those waters. The price at the pump is merely the most visible signal of a much deeper repricing that is working its way through every layer of the global supply chain. This war did not begin with Fujairah, and it will not end with it. The question is whether the involved parties, the US, Iran, Israel, and the Gulf states caught in between, can find a way to halt their escalation before one of them runs out of options. If you want to understand what comes next, whether Iran escalates further into Gulf infrastructure, whether the Hormuz standoff breaks or deepens, and what it means for your economy, subscribe and hit the bell. This is a story that does not pause when the cameras stop rolling.